Zimbabwe is going to the polls today. Can we expect a legitimate outcome? We ask Chris Maroleng, the International CEO of Good Governance Africa. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me on your program. And, I always like to point out that when we look at elections, we need to understand that they are not just an event, but really represent a process that will determine whether an enabling environment has been created in the moments preceding the actual event. And a fair assessment of the situation would indicate to us that an enabling environment has not been created that can ultimately result in the free and fair expression of the will of the people at the polls today.
Well, Chris, before you were booted out of Zimbabwe last week, you did have some time on the ground to do field work and research. What did you come across?
Well, what we came across in Bulawayo as we entered through Joshua Nkomo International Airport in Zimbabwe's second largest city was really a city that we were familiar with, but was looking really run down. And you could see that the deterioration of infrastructure there was really a microcosm of the decline that is the story of Zimbabwe. We also encountered people on the ground who were as usually warm as the people of Bulawayo are, but really very, I'd say, timid in terms of their willingness to express themselves, suspicious of others, because as the state has increasingly become securitized, people are not sure who they speak to. And ultimately, the situation in that country was characterized by living conditions of the majority of people, which have really resulted in a lot of Zimbabweans living in situations of indignity.
Now, I understand that Zanu-PF has been gaining support in the urban areas because the opposition has apparently been either unable or unwilling to deliver the services people need. What did you learn about that?
One of the things that characterizes the politics of Zimbabwe has been the structural weakness of opposition. Currently, we have the CCC, the Citizens Coalition for Change, which is probably the main opposition party to contest this, led by Nelson Chamisa. One of the things that has been criticized about the CCC is that they haven't put into place the necessary campaign structures, and I think also functional structures in the party that can allow for a really effective challenge to the governing Zanu-PF. And this has also been because the enabling environment doesn't exist for such. Nelson Chamisa has complained and said that, many of their campaign rallies were basically stopped or prevented by the government, spuriously arguing that approvals were not sought, etc. And the criticism from outside, from those who would like to see the opposition doing better, is also that one of the key hallmarks of the CCC is that it seems like a political party that is really based on the personality of Nelson Chamisa himself. It's not quite clear as you look down into the second tiers of leadership who these people are and whether this leadership is really credible and ultimately can represent an ideological position that goes beyond simply unseating Zanu-PF. So these criticisms of the CCC are valid, but we cannot move away from the fact that the political environment in Zimbabwe is certainly skewed, and that is from a historical perspective in favor of Zanu-PF.
I hear you. Now, people are fearing that there could be election manipulation, but if we are now looking at an opposition that is weak, the result may in fact be real. Without manipulation, is that a possibility?
So the challenge of not creating a free and fair environment, that is an enabling environment before elections, one that is not characterized by violence and the narrowing of democratic space, especially for those in the opposition, is that it means that the credibility and legitimacy of any electoral outcome is subject to challenge because the environment has not existed for the free expression of even opposition voices. So it may very well be that Zanu-PF legitimately, let's say through a narrow observation of the ballot returns, wins this election. However, as I indicated to you, elections are not just an event. They are also a reflection, in my view, of the voters' roll. And when you look at the voters' roll in Zimbabwe, the opposition still hasn't had access to a verifiable voters' roll that indicates who is eligible to vote in Zimbabwe. This basically means that the election itself, the technical basis of an election, the voters' roll, is subject to challenge. And ultimately, this means that irrespective of any outcome, it can only produce an illegitimate outcome.
Well, talking about an environment that's not enabling you getting kicked out the way you did is an example of an environment like that. Take us through what happened to you, please.
Yeah, before I take you through what happened to us, I think it is really emblematic of a society that is trying to shield and blinker the eyes of the international community from what we suspect are attempts by Zanu-PF to basically hijack this election. If they had nothing to hide, why would Zanu-PF and its government be afraid of 4 researchers coming in to do an assessment of what is going on in the ground? And to that extent, it was strange when we arrived at the airport in Bulawayo because we were met by immigration officials and an unnamed security official who quizzed us and asked us what we were doing. But that was strange because before we left South Africa, we had an opportunity to go to the embassy in Pretoria. And effectively, that is the Zimbabwean embassy in Pretoria, and engage with officials there, including the deputy ambassador of Zimbabwe in South Africa, and indicate to him what the reasons were for our intended trip there. We had also received an invitation from our research partners, another research think tank in Harare known as the SAPES Trust, led by Professor Ibo Mandaza, who had invited us in documentary fashion to come and observe the elections and come and assess the state of governance on the ground, so we would be able to make an assessment. Now, ultimately, what turned out was that we were let in to Bulawayo, that is. We were there for approximately 48 hours, and then 48 hours later, immigration officials accompanied again by plainclothes government agents effectively quizzed us, invited us to come downtown after inspecting our passports to the immigration officers, where they put us in a small room, interrogated us, asked us again what we were doing in Zimbabwe. After about an hour of this interrogation, I asked them directly, have we violated or done anything wrong? And their response that was interesting, because they said, from what we can see, doesn't appear that you have violated anything, whether it's the law, immigration laws, or the laws of Zimbabwe. So we are going to confer with our superiors and tell them as much. About 40 minutes later, they came back, somber looking, saying, our superiors have said we need to deport you with immediate effect. We must escort you to your hotel room where you'll pack your bags, and we'll put you on the first flight out of Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. So that's what happened in a nutshell. And so today, as I sit in front of you, if you ask me, why were you deported from Zimbabwe? We were not given any letter, any notification of deportation, any indication of what we had violated, leading us to a simple conclusion that our ejection and removal from Zimbabwe is nothing less than an illegal deportation.
Now, I saw the Ministry of Information referring to somebody I suspect to be you as an agent provocateur. Did you read yourself into that statement?
Not at all. We were there simply to conduct research. If I was an agent provocateur, I certainly wouldn't have taken, the time to go to the Zimbabwean embassy in South Africa and declare our intention. They knew our exact dates when we were going to be there. They knew when we intended to return to South Africa. They knew what our mission was. We presented them in documentary fashion, evidence of what our plans were, that we were going to be in Bulawayo, and then during the election day in Harare, the capital city. So in my knowledge, insurgents or agent provocateurs do not declare their agenda and their mission in a country. They simply, infiltrate in a covert fashion and carry on with their, insidious work in a country. We are certainly not those guys. We work for a credible research, policy, and advocacy think tank known as Good Governance Africa, where we focus on upgrading and championing good governance across Africa.
Did you get a sense that you could have been under surveillance while you were there?
Not at all. We didn't get the sense, but I think that's the nature of surveillance, that very often you don't know that you're under surveillance. And certainly as people who had nothing to hide, we were not carrying out any counter-surveillance measures because everything that we were doing was really open and had nothing to do with violating any laws or any action that could be seen as unethical or destabilizing or a threat to the security of the Republic of Zimbabwe. So we didn't notice any surveillance, neither were we looking for it because we were there on a legitimate research mission.
Now, I understand that some sections in the long-ruling government do recognize the need to re-engage with the international community and find ways to become part of the international community as a whole again. There is talk of reform and transformation. How seriously can that be taken?
Well, until we see reforms, and that is structural reforms, not just related to the rule of law in Zimbabwe, but also talking about basic freedoms, freedom of association, freedom of expression, and all such norms which are the hallmarks of an open and just society, a democratic society. It doesn't matter which faction of the governing party says what. What counts is whether we can have such reforms that ultimately see the beautiful country of Zimbabwe restoring itself back into the fold of other non-pariah states that recognize these democratic norms. That is the hallmark of what will give us confidence of the fact that these statements are really legitimate and are well meant. It is the actions of the government that we judge them on, not their articulation. Because as you can see, they can invite you into their country and say they do not object to your presence there, but at the same time, in a few days, kick you out. And for many of my other colleagues in research, like Professor Chang, not even allow you into the country and basically restrict you from entering their country. So it doesn't matter how it's articulated. We need to understand that what is before us in Zimbabwe is really a coup regime. 2017, there was a coup in Zimbabwe. It may have been bloodless, and it may have resulted in the removal of someone who was also considered to be a dictator in the form of President Robert Mugabe. But the truth of the matter is any unconstitutional change of power cannot produce democratic outcomes. What it tends to do is replicate itself in the form of people like the autocrat President Emmerson Mnangagwa, by the way, who was present and as security minister in the Robert Mugabe regime. So we cannot expect any democratic outcomes or outcomes that are very different from what we've experienced in Zimbabwe's very checkered history.
Thank you. That was Chris Maroleng, CEO of Good Governance Africa, speaking to BizNews about the Zimbabwean elections this week.
Thank you.